Hello! So today I'm going to be reviewing The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman, which is it's a book I think this is the second or maybe the third time that I've read it, but I came to it again after having not read it for 3 or 4 years, and I've got a feeling I can't remember if I finished it or not last time. So as I usually do, what I'll aim to do is I'll talk a bit about it in general terms, and I'll try and keep that bit spoiler free, and then I'll give you a warning, and then I'll go on to talking about any bits which, you know, you might consider it a spoiler, bits that you might not want anyone to mention before you've read the book yourself. Okay, so The Ocean at the End of the Lane is a fairly short fantasy novel, although I've heard some conversations about, is it fantasy or would you call it magical realism? How exactly would you define it? I'd say it's not fantasy in the way Stardust is fantasy, which has a lot more explicit high fantasy magic in, but there's a really substantial fantastic element, although I think some of the reason for some hesitation about that and how you categorize it is there's a lot of realism in there, and you could read this book as being more about childhood itself and about childhood traumas and difficult families and isolation in childhood, and you can take all those things from it without taking the fantasy elements at face value, although I do take the fantasy elements at face value because it's Neil Gaiman and he writes wonderful fantasy. So in summary, it's a book which is being told from the point of view of a middle-aged narrator who's come back to his old hometown for a funeral, and he goes through the funeral, and then not quite knowing what he's doing, he goes for a drive through the area where he used to live and ends up going back to the place where his old house was when he was a child, and having all these memories, all these things he hasn't thought about for years and years, and telling a story about what happened to him when he was 7 and these strange and terrifying adventures that he went on. So that's kind of the summary, the starting point, synopsis. It's a good book. It's a really good book. It's typically for Neil Gaiman, it's very beautifully written. There's lots of lovely prose and there's lots of lovely ideas, and it's very compelling and it flows nicely, and it's very easy to get swept along with the story and borne up in this magical, strange, scary world, which Neil Gaiman often does this wonderful thing, which is he doesn't over-explain things. It's not like he has this explicit magic system which is really deeply worked out and is almost like a science. He does much more with language and with hints and implication and kind of strange echoes of things, and it's great because it gives this real rich, living, mysterious sense of this world, which I find really compelling. I find it really like convincing and authentic, much more so than in a high fantasy book where there's a distinct magic system that, for example, is comparable to thermodynamics, thinking in particular about certain epic fantasy books, and I love those as well when they're done well, but this is something very different. This is like something undefined and strange and kind of cloying and rich and unsettling. And unsettling is, there's a lot in this book that's unsettling or uncanny. There's a lot that's kind of disturbing, from the way there's a section near the beginning where, well, the story is very linked with death. There's the death at the funeral that starts the story off. Then in the beginning of the main story within a story, the kind of flashback to when he's 7, the whole adventure starts when a dead body is found in the family car, and then this results in the main character meeting some next door neighbours who are kind of magic in a way that's never fully explained, which are, maybe they're witches or maybe they're fairies. They come from the old country and they're ancient and they're not who they seem to be. And I heard someone on another YouTube review refer to them as that kind of triumvirate of the maiden, mother and crone, you know, the 3 witches, and linked to the moon. I think that's probably hitting the nail on the head. That's kind of really what these people are. But anyway, they're essentially this good force that have to take on an evil force, and our hero gets mixed up in all that. And there's a lot of death and subversion and some fairly disturbing, unsettling things. And then there's the arrival of the antagonist, the central villain, who is turning our hero's life upside down and setting his parents against him, and and it's all really beautifully done. And the other thing that the book is about centrally is childhood and memory, and how it is to look back at being at childhood from the point of view of being an adult, and how you might be a child and imagining what it's like to be an adult, and how the worlds are they're totally different, and everything in them is different, including the way time works. So that whole element, that put me in mind of The Child in Time by Ian McEwan, which is a much less fantastical book, although there's elements of the fantastic in it. But that is a really interesting exploration of childhood and of time, hence the title, and I'll do a review of that at some point. But there's bits of this that put me in mind of that because it's about childhood, and it's also about trauma and about growing up and the relationships between children and adults, and how that changes as you get older. So yeah, it's really interesting, a really good book. And the version I read or listened to was narrated by Neil Gaiman, and he's a very good narrator. You see people saying this all the time on forums and on the internet, on comments on YouTube. He's like, there's something about his voice which is just kind of hypnotizing and lulling and magical. So I'd recommend the audiobook as well. And so yeah, in summary, I'd say this is worth your time. It's interesting, it's well written, it's disturbing, and it's rich and strange, and give it a go. And what I'm going to do now, I'll give you a chance to turn off if you haven't read it, because I'm just going to move on to a few bits now which you might consider spoilery. So yeah, I think I've heard people say that they didn't like the ending, and the ending which essentially it reveals that our main character has forgotten all of this, everything that happened to him when he was 7, because it's kind of that way, because of the awful thing that he was involved in, and that's a terrible weight for a child to carry around with them. And so he's actually been back several times throughout his life, and he remembers what's happened, and then when he goes away he forgets that he remembered. And I've heard some people say that that's a cop-out, and I really don't think it is. I think it's adds this other haunting layer to it. And also the other funny thing was, as I said at the beginning of the review, I've read this book like 2 or 3 times, and for some reason I didn't remember the end. I didn't remember this kind of central reveal. And so the thought crossed my mind that maybe one of the wonderful things about this book is it's enchanted, and it's enchanted so that when you read it, part of the enchantment is that you forget what happened. And so bound up in the story is magically the idea of forgetting, and forgetting what it's like to be a child, and remembering again, and then forgetting again. I thought that would be good if Neil Gaiman had the power to actually imbue his novels with actual magic. Well, who knows, maybe. But yeah, I thought that was a funny thing, and I wonder maybe I'll reread it in 10 years and see if I remember it this time. There's stuff that's really disturbing in the book. That scene where the flea, the antagonist, Ursula Monckton, when she has got she's got the main character wrapped around her little finger, and she's manipulating him, and she's turning the father against the son. There's a lot of stuff there that really got under my skin. I mean, there's that kind of sexual element. There's the element of seeing the strangeness of sex and sexual attraction through the eyes of a child and not really understanding it, just knowing that something kind of sinister and disturbing is going on. And then particularly how the father is then influenced when he's kind of holds the main character under the bathwater. Oh, that's really disturbing. That's very unsettling and heartbreaking and moving, powerful. There's some really gross bits as well with the when the worm thing burrows inside his foot, and there's just the description of him trying to pull it out and it snaps off. Oh, all that is shiver-inducing and disgusting. It's interesting because it's not like, it is gross, but it's not that it's just gross out writing. It's like really unsettling, uncanny, strange, disturbing, terrifying even at times. So it does that all really effectively. And I'm reminded when I read that of, you know, Neil Gaiman does go to some dark places. He really, if you've read Sandman, and if you haven't read Sandman, you should definitely read Sandman. It reminds me that in Sandman he's capable of some really weird, disturbing stuff. But it's like he's got this this armory of tricks and tools, and he's like perfectly in command of it. That's the way I see it, and he can take you to these really strange places. That's one of the things that makes him an excellent writer. So where would I put it in terms of other Neil Gaiman books? It's probably in my upper half. I'd put it above a lot of his other stuff, although still for me nothing is quite as outstanding as Sandman. But in terms of the novels, yeah, this is up there. I think I preferred it to American Gods, actually. It's certainly more like real than American Gods. It feels very autobiographical, and I've seen videos where he's talking about, you know, where the idea came from, and apparently it came from, he started it as a short story to write to his wife as like a romantic gesture, to explain the tone of his childhood to her, and then it kind of grew into something else and got out of hand. And I mean, you can see that. In fact, I think the first time I read it, when I was first reading it, and I didn't know any of that. I kind of half thought it was genuinely autobiographical when I started reading it, and then of course like strange monsters come into it, and so that seems less likely that it's genuinely autobiographical. But yeah, it definitely feels very personal. There were scenes in it that reminded me a little bit of Fortunately the Milk, which is obviously, that is a children's book, and like quite a young children's book. But yeah, you can see like the different Neil Gaimans peeking out from behind different chapters in this book. All the kind of the breadth of his skill, and yeah, very good book all in all. So let me know what you thought if you've read it, and if you haven't read it, give it a go. And if you have any suggestions of things that I should read and then review, drop me a line. Okay, bye bye.